Greetings and humble salutations. I am Adebola Omowale. I'm a second year community psychology graduate student from Tampa, Florida. But other than a graduate student, I'm also the son of Katrina Nichols and Franklin Hill Sr. I'm the husband of Kayin Omowale, the father of Ajani Omowale, and most importantly in this context, I'm also a teacher, educator to over 400 students now. After capital A7, capital V7. After with the capital A7, capital V7. Yes. Nah, I put on Vaseline. I thought it'd be nice and shiny, you know. Oh, sorry. I recommend shea butter. Capital V7. There we go. Hey, technical difficulties, hey, age of AI and technology. What can you do? But yeah, so my presentation is on the Mbongi as an instructional technique, fostering critical consciousness and student agency among African American rural high school students. All right, so let's start off with the agenda. What we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about problem statement, purpose and significance of my study, African-centered perspectives, my research questions, literature review, proposed methodology, and you have any questions, I'll answer them. All right, so as a teacher, especially for my high school students, I begin the class with a proverb, and we're gonna do the same thing here, all right? And so let me know if you can finish this proverb. Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? And now I want to apply that in the context of education. Sometimes it's not what you teach, but it's how you teach. All right, so research question. Is there a positive correlation between students' participation in the Mbongi instructional technique and their student agency and critical consciousness? Okay. I know for those of you who you may be like, what's an Mbongi? What's instructional technique, critical consciousness, student agency? Trust me, I'll answer those questions in a few minutes. All right, problem statement. So, at this point in time, right, the government is limiting what students can teach, right? They're literally threatening our livelihoods about teaching the truth about African people and our history. Therefore, I find it very important that teachers find a way to still empower their students. And what I'm considering is we should rethink how we teach. All right, so definition and key variables. Our first variable is the Mbongi. And the Mbongi is a spiritual, political, and educational institution that lies at the heart of the community, particularly in the Kikongo. Instructional technique. Instructional techniques are the specific experiences or tools used to deliver instructions. Critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is the capacity of a group or marginalized people to analyze and create actions that will address their reality. And student agency is basically refers to learners' proactive acts either aligned with the teacher's instruction or against it, but with the purpose of pushing the educational goals forward for the group. So the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study is to investigate the relationship between the Mbongi, which is an African-centered instructional technique, and students' agency and critical consciousness. In doing so, the students, or the study, will address the lack of literature on student agency among African-American adolescents, African-centered instructional techniques, and critical consciousness among African-American rural students. This study will lay a foundation for future research on the effectiveness of African-centered instructional techniques and African-centered educational pedagogy praxis. The significance of the study. So, this study affirms the ancestral wisdom and traditions of our people and provides literature to support the notion that those ancestral wisdom and traditions are needed today in order to reproduce the best of ourselves, i.e. our children. Furthermore, the implications of the study are far-reaching as it raises awareness to other educators about potential instructional techniques they can use that are culturally grounded and that are actually effective. And these teachers can then use these instructional techniques with African populations or first world populations. Right? Hypothesis. There will be significant positive correlation between students' participation in the Mbongi and their student agency and critical consciousness. So, my African-centered perspective. In creating this study, I had to do a very vital thing, and that's go through the re-Africanization process in my own thinking. And the re-Africanization process can be simplified into 3 steps: rediscovery, redefine, and revitalize. So the rediscovery aspect, we had to go back, or I had to go back and look at our ancestral traditions and see what is viable, what can I bring forth, and redefine it in a way that is applicable within the educational context of today. And revitalize is actually putting those things into practice with my students. The study contributes to the praxis of African-centered education, which is fundamentally concerned with molding African children to think and act in the best interest of themselves, their families, and African people. Thus, this study is firmly grounded within African worldview and promoting the African survival thrust. Literature review. So let's first start with the Mbongi. The Mbongi, again, functions as a space, a physical, but also an educational space that allows people to bring up topics, that allows people to debate, that allows people to criticize their community, their leadership. It also is a space where people can go and have their eyes opened or become aware of what's going on in the world. And it's important to acknowledge that the Mbongi is not particular, right, to the Kikongo in the context that this institution is practiced all over Africa. For example, right, in the Zulu, right, it's the Indaba. Amongst the Kikuyu people, right, the Luba people, and the Igbo people, this institution is practiced throughout Africa. Now, how do I redefine the Mbongi within, let's say, a charter school system or a public educational system? So the Mbongi is separated into 2 parts. The first part, right, students have to conduct research, right? And the research is basically what we call a CCER. The first C stands for context, the second C stands for claim, the E stands for evidence, and the R stands for reasoning, right? And so with the context, they have to look at the social, political, historical, or cultural context of the topic of their choice. Then they have to make a claim or a definite opinion about that topic. They have to find evidence for that topic. And then the reasoning is they have to explain why is the topic relevant to their peers or to the class or to their community. The second part is the actual Mbongi, right, where we tie and untie knots, or in other words, where we bring up problems and create solutions for those problems in the same way it was done in indigenous context, right? And so, of course, the rules for the Mbongi, one of them is you have to be respectful. Another one is what happens in the Mbongi stays in the Mbongi. Unless I give my students a choice, right? They're allowed to tell their parents, of course, and they're also allowed, right, to tell administrators. But doing that helps create a safe space for the Mbongi. And lastly, the procedures. So I love this aspect of it because this is where, as a teacher, I get to sit back, right, and let students take charge. And so students, they will share their topic and they will lead the discussion. In addition, the second step is the other students in the class, they will ask clarifying questions about the topic. And then lastly, we'll just have a structured dialogue with everyone. Literature review continue. So studies in critical consciousness have mainly focused on students in Northwest or northern areas, right? And this could propose a problem as far as if we've seen as recent migration patterns within the Black U.S. community, more Black people are actually moving south, right, versus going north, right? And so the lack of studies within Southern populations is, is a problem. In addition, right, instruments used to measure student agency were created for college level readers, right, and not high school students. So this could propose a problem when we're trying to measure that. Lastly, right, the research for student agency, there hasn't been much research done for Black students, right? And so there's a lot of gaps within the research for student agency and critical consciousness. And so that's where my study becomes very important and innovative. Proposed methodology. So I did not collect data, but if I did, this is how I would do it. So first, right, another limitation within the research of critical consciousness and student agency is the sample size. And so I will propose a large sample size of at least 300 students from Title I schools who are on free and reduced lunch, and participants will also have to be in high school between 9th and 12th grade. Next, instruments. I'll use a critical consciousness scale and a student agency scale. Methodology, of course, will be self-survey, a pre and post test, as all teachers do. And analysis, or do a correlation analysis. Now, a question you may be asking, why would I test students who are in Title I schools or who are on free reduced lunch? Well, the idea behind critical consciousness is that students have to analyze their reality and create actions to address that reality. And within my opinion, that students who are economically disadvantaged, students who are potentially politically disadvantaged, need the critical consciousness the most in order to address their oppressive reality. And that's the end of my presentation. Questions, comments, concerns? All right, all right. I don't know if you're still live, but if you're out there, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Davis. I am a first-year graduate student here at FAMU at Community Psychology, and I'll be presenting social comparison orientation, self-esteem, and interpersonal behavior among Black college students. So starting with my abstract overview, my study examines the relationship between social comparison, self-esteem, and interpersonal behavior. I wanted to really focus on within groups of Black students to try to close that gap, and that's what my research seems to do. It seems to like close that gap because there's not a lot of research that focus on within groups of Black people, specifically Black college students, when in comparison with each other. So I used my design that I use an online survey consisted of 3 measures and scales, and I used SPSS to analyze the data, and I made conclusions about it. So my research purpose, again, this purpose of the study is to examine how social comparison and how it relates to self-worth and interpersonal behavior within the Black community, trying to close that gap. So research shows that social comparison influence self-worth. It leads to lower psychological well-being and impacts self-worth. But is this possibly true when you think about Black people, or is the research that's already out there not specific to us and our cultural experience? So the importance of this research, which leads to my importance of this research, and so why I wanted to do this study, because there's not a lot of research about that. And also, my research can also find if these limitations can see how Black people interact with one another and things like that. It shows social support. So my hypothesis was that I believe that social comparison impacts self-esteem and also interpersonal behavior. After doing research on 80 students here at FAMU, I conducted my research during institutions at HBCUs and predominantly white institutions. 95% of my people, 95% of my participants were Black students who went to school, and my research found that even though like there were forms of social comparison, it did not relatively relate to self-worth or interpersonal behavior. My self-worth results showed that there were moderate to high levels of self-worth, which means people showed a lot of self-worth within themselves. And my interpersonal behavior, when it came to that, it was a high level of pro-social behavior. Example, meaning that people showed high levels of helping behaviors, showing empathy to others. Although there were social comparison involved, Black people had a tendency to socially compare. However, it did not impact how people felt about themselves and how they treated other people. So with the findings, it led to my discussions at the end and saying like some of my in my discussion section, Black people, because of our Afrocentric and our African communal living, can speak to as like a reason why Black people doesn't allow other things like social comparison to impact how we feel about ourselves, and how we feel about ourselves. And so, in conclusion, we see that there needs to be more research, and one of my limitations of my study is the constitutions of institutionalize it, whether if it's at PWIs or HBCUs. Maybe their environment could play a part in if social comparison affects one's self-worth or interpersonal behavior. So thank you for my research, and any questions?
Hi, I am Essence Wright. I'm a second year community psychology scholar all the way from Sebring, Florida. Have you ever been innocently scrolling on social media and you come across an image or a reel of a woman caressing her breasts or caressing her buttocks? Or a man who intentionally wore gray sweatpants and he's thrusting his hips in such a way that you can see the length and the width of his penis? And in that moment, did you become sexually aroused from the images and the content that was presented to you? Now, perhaps it didn't just stop at your screen. Maybe you decided to engage and indulge in pornography consumption based on the interest that your algorithm picked up. In this presentation, I'll explore the relationship between sexually explicit images on social media and porn consumption and indulgence in young African American adults. So a bit of the overview, I'll go over the research problem, the purpose of the study, definition of key variables, hypothesis and rationale, the review of literature, and depictions of women and men in pornography. So my research problem, exposure patterns may increase the frequency of pornography use and the spread of explicit content across social media platforms. And my research question is, how does such exposure to sexually explicit imagery, including AI-generated content on social media, influence porn consumption among young African American adults? My purpose of the study, or the research focus, investigates the relationship between exposure to sexually explicit material on social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, including both user-generated and AI-generated sexual imagery, and how this exposure may influence individual pornography consumption habits, with the focus on the early onset of potential addiction. And also, how does this exposure influence the perceptions of young African American men and women? The purpose of this study is to assess the correlation between the frequent exposure to pornography on social media platforms and subsequent interest and indulgence in pornographic activities. And just to provide a bit of clarity, I want to define some variables for you and some terms you may hear me use throughout the presentation. So pornography consumption is an action that involves the viewing of sexually explicit content, including images, videos, and other forms of media for the purpose of sexual gratification. Sexually explicit material, these are reels, photos, and content that depicts sexual activities like nudity or sexual organs in a manner that is considered lascivious. Social cognitive theory suggests that people can learn behaviors through repeated exposure via media and a deep fake. This is a video, an image in which a person's face, body, or voice has been digitally altered so that they appear to be someone else, typically used maliciously. So my hypothesis: exposure to sexually explicit images on the media platform, certain social media platforms, may be correlated with pornography consumption among young adults. And my rationale: increased exposure to such content on social media platforms is positively associated with higher rates of porn consumption among college-aged adults. So a bit about my literature. I found that young adults increasingly encounter sexually explicit material through major social media platforms that we love and enjoy, such as Facebook and Instagram, and such exposure can lead to how much we engage in pornography outside of that content, and we develop a sense of normalcy and we become desensitized to what we see in real time. So what we see in the media won't necessarily faze us, and once we see it in schools or in the grocery stores or at nightclubs, we won't be necessarily fazed. For the past few weeks, I've been seeing so much content about the Houston rodeo and some of the images and the portrayals that many parents of young children have expressed due to the lack of dress code. Many women had on very low-cut tops and Daisy Dukes, and their butt cheeks were hanging out, and parents were completely upset because they thought it was a family affair. So I'm going through some of the comments of those videos and reading a few articles, and some younger people in the generation are saying, you know, well, it's my body. I can do what I want to do. I can flaunt it. God bless me with it. And then some are saying, you know, you only live once. Why not? Another said, well, it's past a certain hour. Your child shouldn't be there. But parents are saying this should not be normalized. We should have more couth and self-respect for ourselves. And women and men who are also exposed to media such as this begin to ingest certain stereotypes, such as the Buck stereotype and the Jezebel stereotype, especially for young African American women, that is rooted in enslavement. So exposure to explicit material may contribute to desensitization of sexual content and could lead to risky behaviors and sexual activity for adolescents between the ages of 12 and 18. So the more media that young people ingest, the more likely they are to, one, start to think about having sex at a very early age, two, indulge in pornography. The study of 404 African American undergraduates found higher levels of TV realism. The perception that TV is an accurate representation of life was related to the endorsement of the Jezebel stereotype. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. So AI and hyper accessibility of explicit content. So advancement in artificial intelligence has enabled the rapid creation of highly realistic sexually explicit images and videos, increasing the overall volume of explicit content available online. Additionally, AI-generated sexual imagery may reinforce existing racialized sexual stereotypes, as pornography has historically depicted Black women as targets as aggression and Black men as more sexually dominant. So while there is no exact percentage of AI-generated sexual content on social media, research shows that there is a vast majority of deepfakes. And as I mentioned before, a deepfake is just AI-generated content, fake content that looks real. And I think we've all been a victim to that. Between 96 and 98% of AI-generated content is pornographic in nature. Additionally, studies indicate that exposure to AI-generated content is increasingly, particularly among young people, highlighting a growing concern in digital environments. There was a Twitch streamer named QT Cinderella, and one of the users created pornographic images and a video of her. And she went on her live stream and she also filed a lawsuit because obviously, you know, she has a platform and she's going on these Twitch streams and she's advocating for herself. And she also expressed in a stream that she has to continue to express and fight for her name, for her family, and for herself as well. So you can only imagine as an influencer that she lost many endorsements presently and in the future. And this is a growing concern for Black women especially. This may be harmful as Black women are already considered hypersexual. So when deep fakes are created, people are more likely to believe that it's not AI generated. So that means there will be lower protection and media narratives for Black women, so we won't be taken as seriously. And although we may praise the advancements of AI and artificial intelligence, it can be quite destructive. And you don't necessarily need heavy machinery to do this. It's as simple as going into your Apple Play Store or going into your Google Play Store and downloading an app. Last year, I presented on the same topic, and I did a study, a quantitative study, and these are some of my results. I have a Pearson correlation output table and a scatter plot. So there seems to be a high correlation between porn consumption and high social media usage for 29.3% of my participants, and that was about 22 of them. 8% of participants report high social media usage and low porn consumption, about 6 of them. 6.6% participants reported low social media usage and high porn consumption, 5 of my participants. And 56 reported high social media usage and low porn consumption. So let's get a bit into the depictions of Black men in pornography. Research identifies that there are racialized portrayals of Black men, and studies suggest that Black men are often depicted as more sexual and animalistic than white men. and they are also less intimate towards partners. These portrayals, again, reinforce stereotypes of hypermasculinity and dominance. One study found that Black men were more frequently depicted as perpetrators of aggression and less likely to display certain acts of intimacy, such as kissing, compared to white men. How are Black women depicted in pornography? Black women are frequently depicted as targets as aggression. So Black women are the targets and the Black men are perpetrators. Sexual scenes involving Black couples contain higher levels of aggression, and Black women may be portrayed through racialized stereotypes as well, such as the Jezebel stereotype. Furthermore, a content analysis of 300 online pornographic videos found that women were overall more objectified than men using the objectification index, indicating that included genital focus, genital gapping, double penetration, stripping, facial ejaculation, and sexual aggression. And what are some of the racialized depictions of African American men? So media depictions of Black sexualities are influenced by historical stereotypes. Again, they are animalistic and aggressive and hypersexual. Dr. Colby Cambon gave this example in the Rhett book of the Black African Psychology, a buck being someone who is dumb, someone who is ignorant, someone who has a high sex drive, someone who has low intelligence, someone who has overlarge genitals. Black men are frequently portrayed as sexually dominant. These portrayals may influence perceptions of the Black sexuality in our current society. Stereotypes of Black women in social media. Research identifies a hysterical stereotype known as the Jezebel stereotype, which portrays Black women as hypersexual, seductive, and sexually aggressive. And I want you to take a look at the photo at the bottom left-hand corner. Does anything about that photo tell you that she wants to seduce this man, or is she hypersexual at all? Or any of the films of the enslavement era, do any of those women portray that? But we seem to have embodied that, and we became this woman here in the corner. This stereotype has roots in enslaved era racial narratives and continues to influence modern media portrayals. Studies suggest these stereotypes can influence sexual expectations, relationship perceptions, social attitudes towards Black women. Dr. Colby Cambon, in chapter 13 of the Black African Psychology book, talked about the distortion, the injection, and the misorientation of Black people. The distortion: society produces distorted images of Black people, such as the buck and as the Jezebel. And the injection, which is the repeated exposure, which shapes identity and influences our beliefs. And lastly, the misorientation or the embodiment. People begin to adopt beliefs about themselves that come from harmful portrayals from a society that was designed to destroy their identity. Conversely, Charles Cooley, a Eurocentric theorist, coined the term the looking glass self. This theory posed that we develop our sense of self based on how we believe others perceive and judge us, using social interaction as a reflective surface to determine our identity and our worth. But Dr. Colby Cambon argues that this ideology is shaped by historical, cultural, and racial systems that often distort the Black identity. Social media, therefore, acts as a mirror for Black people, reflecting back images and messages that can shape the self-concept, the behavior, and the expectations. So as African people, we should be working diligently to dismantle harmful portrayals that work to annihilate our identity. The limitations that I saw within some of these studies: the lack of prior research on pornography consumption at HBCUs, and limited research on AI-generated sexual content. Thank you, Dr. Robertson, for your ongoing support and encouragement throughout this project. Your dedication has had a lasting impact on my development as an aspiring clinician. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Lane Blake. I am a second-year community psychology master's student here at Florida A&M University, and today I represent my research, Mending the Divide, exploring the impact of belongingness on LGBTQ plus students, well-being, and student engagement at HBCUs. So, just to give some context and background, as we know, HBCUs, also known as historically black colleges and universities, are a place that was developed as a means of providing educational support and knowledge to black and African American people during a time when that access was not easily accessible due to racism and discrimination. Currently, over the time, HBCUs have prided themselves on racial uplift and making sure that we're empowering the next generation of African American people. Although HBCUs pride themselves on racial uplift and empowerment through knowledge, there are some challenges that persist. HBCUs are experiencing sexism, heterosexism, and cissexism. This impacts black queer individuals, having them feel feelings of isolation, reduced sense of connection, and increased mental health concerns such as stress, depression, and anxiety, just to name a few. Moving on. So now that you have some background, the purpose of my study is to examine how community connectedness, also known as a sense of belongingness, is impacting one's psychological well-being and student engagement, which I'll define later on. Right now. So community connectedness is defined as the desire to belong to a larger collective. Psychological well-being is defined as the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive through challenges. And student engagement is defined as the time and effort devoted to educationally purposeful activities. So through this, by producing this study, the goal is that we are assessing whether our black queer students at HBCUs are feeling supported, if they feel as though they belong, so that we can therefore inform educators, researchers, and institutions on how to be more inclusive spaces for our black queer students. So moving on to the literature review, I will be talking about what it means to be a black and queer person, then moving on to the community connectedness, respectability politics, psychological well-being, and then student engagement. So as black queer individuals, they are experiencing what is called intergroup marginalization. So being a black queer person, you experience racism from the greater society, but then you also experience within your own community your own senses of discrimination and oppression. This comes up as a sense of othering, where you feel as though, where do I belong? You're also constantly facing this thing as though there's something wrong with you, or you need to be changed, or you have to alter yourself in order to fit into different spaces. And so, therefore, individuals may experience internalized racism or heterosexism, feelings of powerlessness, low self-esteem, and psychological distress. And just to give some statistics, 46% of black queer youth consider suicide in the past year. 60% have experienced depression or felt anxious. And then 71 of black trans youth reported depression or anxiety, with 46% showing experiencing suicidal ideation. Moving on to community connectedness. As we know, community, as black and African American people, community is a huge thing. It is the main thing used to fight against minority stress, the ability to connect with those who are around you and feel as though that you belong, you having that support system. And so belonging to the black community supports identity development and protects the mental health and fights against minority stress, as I said. For example, just think about black queer spaces in general, foster joy, affirmations, and connection, reducing minority stress. However, like I was saying before, black queer individuals are experiencing oppression within their own community and the greater community. So when you are in the black spaces, you probably are experiencing homophobia or exclusion in some black spaces, which is translated within HBCU context at times. Moving on, one of the main results of black queer individuals experiencing oppression within their own group is because of respectability politics. Respectability politics in the beginning was used as a safety strategy or a coping strategy as a means of no longer being seen as inferior, being seen as respectable African American people who can provide to a greater society. However, over time, those things have been rooted in heteronormative practices, patriarchy, and classist norms, which, in terms of queer individuals, just the queer idea of being queer goes against that. And so the idea is that you are a good Black person, and it's set by a Western ideology of what is good, what is morally good, and what is religiously accepted. So that then distorts how we view our Black queer figures. Just to think of like us now talking about figures such as Bayard Rustin or James Baldwin, Black queer individuals who have been erased or their queerness has been erased from them. As we move on, as it pertains to how it relates to HBCUs, these things have been put into like policies or our norms of how one needs to dress or how we believe that things should go in terms of man and woman. And then from there, this progresses, yet students emphasize more, even though we are progressing, there are a lot of HBCUs that have LGBTQIA centers and programmings and groups. However, students are still saying that there is a need for a change, that there is still work that can be done. Moving on to one of our variables, psychological well-being. So psychological well-being is your ability to adapt and change as time goes on, and this is very imperative as college students because you, in most cases, many are away from home, away from friends and family. You are emerging adults, so you're developing what it is to be on your own and make decisions by yourself. So it's imperative that you are able to do that. Moving on to student engagement, it is your ability to really feel as though that you connect with your environment, that you're connecting with those around you, and in terms of getting a higher education. So the research questions that I wanted to answer are: how is community connectedness related to Black queer student engagement? How is community connectedness connected to their psychological well-being? And then is there a difference between Black queer students and non-queer students? So the hypothesis is that there is a correlation between community connectedness and student engagement, as well as community connectedness and student engagement, and that those queer students would have a poor psychological well-being and poor student engagement compared to their non-queer counterparts. Moving on to our research design, as I stated, we're measuring to see if there's connection between community connectedness and psychological well-being, and then community connectedness and student engagement. They will be used in a survey where participants are answering demographic questions, and then later on, moving on to the three sub-skills that we have. From there, the participants specifically are HBCU students, obviously, undergraduate and graduate students, and across the various HBCUs, just to name a few: FAMU, Spelman, Bethune-Cookman, etc. And then finally identifying as Black or of African descent. So, as I stated, it was a Collegiate survey. These are the three sub-skills that we used: sense of social fit scale, used to measure community connectedness; the Swedish Rifkin psychological well-being scale to measure psychological well-being; and then the engagement evaluation questionnaire was used to measure student engagement. So just to show a demographic, overall we had 352 participants. The overall age was 22 years. The large majority of the participants identify as women, and the racial group, as I said, African American. And then the mean GPA was a 3.1, and then also what I highlighted, which is this 3.25, is that the main majority did not know if their HBCU had a queer or LGBTQ plus programming or center. Moving on to our results. So as you can see, there is a correlation between community connectedness and student engagement. Students who feel more connected are more engaged with their academic environment. There's a weak but still significant positive relationship between sense of belongingness and psychological well-being, their ability to adapt, and overall, there is a positive relationship, meaning as one increases, the other increases as well in terms of community connectedness and psychological well-being. Finally here, currently still in the data analysis process, what we can see is that our hypotheses 3 and 4 were definitely supported. There's a moderate, like I said, moderate to significant positive relationship and small but significant positive relationships. Finally, moving on to our limitations, a large population, 345 of participants attended FAMU. Then also a lot of them were gained through the psychology department. And then, like I said, there were more predominantly women who participated in the survey. So it'd be really good to have a representation from male and non-binary individuals. Finally, as we know, when you're doing self-reporting surveys, there could be sampling bias or statement comprehension errors. Future research, expanding the pool. Like I said, we predominantly had FAMU students, so getting a larger pool from other HBCUs. And then finally, doing a mixed method approach where we're having a qualitative aspect to the quantitative as well, getting surveys and getting raw information and answers, excuse me. Finally, in conclusion, this is what we're working towards. We are working towards an environment where HBCUs are definitely empowering its students and being intentional and allowing their students to feel seen and connected. So up here, you'll see enrollment management, academic classroom experience, out of classroom experience, queer and trans HBCU alumni engagement. These are the 4 pillars in which could be used to empower and allow Black queer students to feel like they belong and are connected to their HBCUs. And overall, that's my research. I would like to thank my committee, Dr. Novell Tani, Dr. Gwendolyn Singleton, and Dr. Kamambidi, as well as my research team, Laisha and Zakia. I really do appreciate you all. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elijah Hutchinson. I am a second-year community psychology student from FAMU, hailing from West Palm Beach, Florida. Today, I will be presenting my literature review entitled Healing Through Sound, a historical and cultural analysis of music as a coping tool in Black communities. This presentation explores how musical traditions from spirituals to hip-hop have historically supported resilience, cultural identity, and collective healing within the Black community. First, I will introduce my problem statement and purpose. Next, I will present the research questions and guided preposition. Then I will discuss the significance and cultural framework or conceptual framework. I will review the literature and finally conclude with the methodology and key takeaways. Let's begin. Although music has played a central role in the cultural and social life of Black communities, mainstream psychological research often overlooks music as a culturally grounded coping strategy. Many traditional psychological frameworks emphasize individual therapy and clinical interventions, which may not fully capture communal practices such as music, storytelling, and spirituality. As a result, the psychological significance of African American musical traditions remains unexplored. Within Black communities, music serves as a tool for coping with hardship, expressing emotions, and strengthening communal bonds. In response to this gap in the literature, this study was designed with the following purpose. This study examines how musical traditions have supported emotional expression, identity, and resilience during periods of social hardship. Drawing from African-centered psychology, cultural studies, and music history, it explores how music contributes to collective healing and psychological well-being. To guide this investigation, this study is organized around 3 research questions. The first question focuses on how music has historically functioned as a coping mechanism within Black communities, particularly during periods of oppression. The second question examines how musical traditions have reinforced cultural identity, belonging, and resilience. The third question explores how African-centered psychology explains the relationship between music, culture, and collective healing. Music functions as a culturally grounded coping mechanism within Black communities. Throughout history, musical traditions have created spaces for emotional expression, cultural perseverance, and communal connection. From spirituals during the enslaved era to contemporary genres of music like hip-hop, music has helped individuals and communities interpret hardship and shared collective experiences within the Black community. Research also shows that engagement with culturally meaningful music supports identity development and psychological well-being. African-centered perspectives further emphasize that healing occurs within cultural and communal contexts. Together, these ideas suggest that music not only operates as an artistic expression, but as a practice that supports coping, resilience, and community empowerment. Given this understanding, it is important to consider, why does this research matter? This research highlights the importance of cultural traditions as sources of resilience and psychological well-being. By examining music through an African-centered framework, it shows how community-based practices contribute to emotional healing and community empowerment. It also expands on conversations in psychology by recognizing that healing practices often exist outside of traditional Western Eurocentric models. Understanding the role in music in Black communities can help psychologists develop more culturally relevant approaches in mental health. To better interpret these ideas, the study is grounded in an African-centered framework. This conceptual framework emphasizes African cultural values, history, and communal identity in understanding psychological well-being. Unlike many Western approaches that focus on individualism, African-centered psychology highlights the importance of shared identity and collective responsibility. Within this perspective, cultural practices such as music and storytelling play a central role in the mental health and well-being of the Black community. It recognizes that healing occurs both individually and collectively, with well-being closely tied to relationships, traditions, and historical awareness. In this context, music becomes more than just entertainment. It functions as a culturally grounded tool that supports identity, connection, and psychological healing. With this framework in mind, we can now turn to the literature examining how music has historically functioned within Black communities. African drumming traditions played an essential role in many Western and Central African societies where drums were used for communication, ceremonies, and cultural expression. When enslaved Africans were brought to America, they carried these same traditions and practices with them. However, enslavers became concerned that the drums would be used to coordinate a resistance movement or a rebellion across many of the plantations. After events such as the Stono Rebellion in 1739, colonial authorities in several regions banned the drums to limit communication and collective organization. Despite these restrictions, enslaved Africans adapted by using body percussion movements such as clapping, stomping, and call and response singing. These adaptations allowed cultural practices to survive despite efforts to suppress them. Over time, these evolving forms contributed to the development of spirituals. W.E.B. Du Bois referred to these songs as sorrow songs, emphasizing their emotional and spiritual significance. These songs allowed enslaved individuals to express grief and suffering while still maintaining hope for freedom. Because spirituals were performed collectively, they strengthened communal bonds and helped preserve cultural traditions despite attempts to erase them. They also served as tools of resilience and shared identity within enslaved communities. While spirituals provided emotional and spiritual coping, they also served as a second critical function, which was resistance and communication. Spirituals helped preserve cultural identity and strengthen solidarity amongst enslaved communities. Some songs, such as Wade in the Water, have been interpreted as containing coded messages to connect escape routes to the Underground Railroad. Even when not directly coded, these songs express hope, resistance, and survival in face of oppression. As Black communities moved beyond the enslaved era, these traditions evolved into new musical forms which maintained their cultural purpose. These genres highlighted different dimensions of the Black experience. Blues speaks to the hardship and perseverance, while gospel reinforced spiritual strengthening within the Black church. Jazz music emphasized creativity and improvisation, while soul music reflected the identity and social awareness. Together, these genres continued the tradition of music as a tool for emotional expression and cultural preservation. Although these styles emerged in different historical time periods, they remained connected through a continuous cultural tradition within Black communities. This continuity becomes especially evident in forms of expression, particularly in hip hop, which builds upon and extends earlier traditions. Hip hop has become one of the most influential forms of cultural expression within Black communities. It provides a platform for articulating lived experiences through related to systematic inequality and social injustice through storytelling and lyrical expression. Through this process, artists were able to communicate both personal and collective struggles through their lyrics. Scholars argued that hip hop intended to promote empowerment by helping individuals reinterpret their experiences with broader social contexts. This timeline illustrates the evolution of Black musical traditions from Negro spirituals to hip hop. Although the musical style has changed, the cultural function remains consistent. Across generations, music continues to support cultural identity, emotional expression, and psychological well-being. Beyond social commentary, it also supports identity development and psychological well-being. Research shows that engagement with culturally meaningful music has shaped identity and supports cultural or psychological well-being. Travis and Bowman found that music engagement is associated with a stronger racial identity and cultural pride amongst the African American youth. Music therefore functions as both a cultural resource and an emotional outlet that supports identity development and community connection. When viewed through an African-centered lens, these roles highlight the deeper psychological, cultural significance of music. After examining these historical and cultural roles that has played across music, the next step is to explain how this study approaches the literature and identify the themes. This study uses a qualitative literature review approach to examine the role of music within the Black community. It synthesizes existing research from peer-reviewed journal articles and scholarly texts. The selected literature focuses on the relationship between music, cultural identity, and psychological well-being within the African American community. Special attention is given to the historical sources and African-centered psychological frameworks to better understand the culturally grounded experiences. Through this synthesis, key terms such as emotional expression, identity development, resilience, and collective empowerment were identified. To close, this literature review highlights the significant role music has played in the survival and resilience in the Black community. From spirituals during the enslaved era to contemporary forms of music like hip hop, music has served as a meaningful emotional expression, a cultural perseverance for the Black community, and collective storytelling. More importantly, when viewed through an African-centered lens, music is not just understood as entertainment, but a communal practice that's rooted in shared identity, historical awareness, and collective responsibility. Across generations, musical traditions have supported healing, reinforced cultural pride, and strengthened community bonds, especially in the face of oppression. Ultimately, recognizing music as a culturally grounded coping mechanism expands how psychology understands resilience, shifting the focus from individual healing alone to include the power of community, culture, and collective experiences. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning. My name is Taylor Abraham. I'm a second-year student of the Community Psychology program, and today this presentation, an AI algorithm approach to understanding the relationship between social media usage and stress levels amongst Black collegiate athletes, is an integrative analysis of existing research to examine how AI-driven social media use relates to stress within this population. It synthesizes evidence on problematic media use, racialized experiences, and algorithmic amplification to assess how increased exposure to harmful content may contribute to elevated stress levels. This is my agenda for today. First, I'm going to disclose my research questions, my purpose statement and significance, my lit review, methodology, results and findings, and then a conclusion. My research questions. What is the relationship between problematic social media use and perceived stress among Black collegiate athletes? Does exposure to algorithmically amplified negative or racialized content on social media predict higher levels of perceived stress among Black collegiate athletes? And how do AI-driven social media algorithms shape the online experiences and psychological stress levels of Black collegiate athletes? My hypotheses. Higher scores on the social media disorder scale will be positively associated with higher perceived stress scores among Black collegiate athletes. Greater exposure to racialized or negative content amplified by social media algorithms will significantly predict higher perceived stress levels among Black collegiate athletes, and Black collegiate athletes who experience greater exposure to AI-driven social media algorithms that amplify negative, racialized, or comparison-oriented content will report higher levels of perceived psychological stress than those with lower exposure to such algorithmically curated content. My problem statement. Collegiate athletes experience significant academic, athletic, and psychological pressures that can affect mental health, with Black collegiate athletes often facing additional stressors such as racial discrimination and limited access to culturally responsive mental health resources. Social media plays a major role in athletes' public identities, but it can also expose them to cyberbullying, racialized commentary, performance criticism, and algorithmically amplified negative content. This study examines the relationship between social media use and perceived stress among Black collegiate athletes. Purpose statement and significance. The purpose of the study is to examine the relationship between social media use and perceived stress amongst Black collegiate athletes, with particular attention to how AI-driven content amplification shapes athletes' online experiences. Additionally, the study explores whether exposure to racialized and comparison-oriented content on social media contributes to increased psychological stress within this population. The research is significant because it highlights how algorithmically curated digital environments may influence the mental health of Black collegiate athletes. Now I'm going to define some of our major variables. Perceived stress is the extent to which individuals feel their lives are overwhelming or uncontrollable, measured by the perceived stress scale. Problematic social media use refers to compulsive or excessive engagement with social media that interferes with daily functioning, measured by the social media disorder scale. AI-driven algorithmic content amplification is the use of artificial algorithms by social media platforms to prioritize and recommend content based on user engagement patterns. Now I'm going to get into my literature review. The first topic is mental health in collegiate athletes. The second is social media use and psychological distress. Then I get into racialized media and online harassment. And then finally, algorithmic amplification and AI-driven content curation. So mental health in collegiate athletes. Collegiate athletes experience high stress from balancing academics and athletics, contributing to mental health challenges. Stigma and fear of judgment from teammates and coaches often discourage athletes from seeking help. Black collegiate athletes face additional pressures such as racial discrimination, social isolation, underrepresentation, and limited culturally responsive mental health resources. Social media use and psychological distress. Oh, Lord. So social media allows collegiate athletes to build identity, connect with audiences, and promote themselves through name, image, likeness, also known as NIL branding. Increased online visibility also exposes athletes to constant public scrutiny. Excessive or problematic social use is linked to higher stress, anxiety, and depressive symptoms. Online feedback, criticism, and cyberbullying can intensify social comparison, performance pressure, and psychological strain for student athletes. Racialized media, representation, and online harassment. Black athletes often face racialized commentary on social media that reinforces stereotypes prioritizing physical ability over intellect. High-profile incidents of racist abuse towards athletes highlight broader patterns of online hostility. Repeated exposure can contribute to stereotype threat, identity fatigue, and increased psychological stress, especially when athletes feel pressure to anticipate or respond to discrimination. Algorithmic amplification and AI-driven content curation. AI-driven algorithms curate and rank social media content through automated personalization systems. This amplification can also increase exposure to biased or low credibility information in digital environments. Engagement-based algorithms amplify posts that receive high interactions, increasing their visibility. Because these systems prioritize high engaging content, emotionally charged or controversial posts are more likely to spread widely online. So, my methodology. These studies used a mixed method, AI-informed research designed to examine the relationship between social media usage and perceived stress among Black collegiate athletes. Quantitative survey data and algorithmic analysis of social media exposure patterns were combined to understand how AI-driven content amplification may influence psychological stress. So the results. Findings across the revealed studies indicate that AI-driven algorithmic amplification may intensify stress among Black collegiate athletes by increasing exposure to racialized and harmful content. Research consistently shows that Black athletes experience unique socio-cultural stressors linked to media representation. While validated measures confirm the association between social media use and perceived stress, evidence from another study further demonstrates the psychological burden of repeated racialized experiences. Ribeiro et al. Highlights how AI-driven content curation amplifies emotionally salient and extreme material, suggesting that algorithmic systems may increase both the frequency and intensity of exposure to discriminatory content. Collectively, these findings support a correlational relationship in which algorithmically amplified media exposure contributes to heightened and cumulative stress. The integrative analysis indicates that the study's hypotheses are supported but not definitely proven. Evidence from the reviewed literature consistently shows a positive association between problematic social media use and higher perceived stress among Black collegiate athletes, supporting the first hypothesis. Additionally, research on racialized media experiences and algorithmic amplification suggests that greater exposure to negative or racialized content curated by AI-driven algorithms is linked to the increase of psychological stress, providing support for the second and third hypotheses. However, because these supporting studies primarily use cross-sectional and correlational methodologies, the findings cannot establish direct causality. Instead, the integrative analysis demonstrates a consistent pattern of relationship indicating that AI-driven social media environments likely contribute to heightened stress among Black collegiate athletes. Overall, the hypotheses are empirically supported by the literature, but should be interpreted as correlational rather than causal conclusions. Thank you.